If you needed a reason to hate Konami, they're primarily the reason why most fan games are shut down by developers. That's not an exaggeration either, because on April 27th, 1999, Konami would successfully sue a company by the name of Spec Computer who sold a GameShark-like device, and later on August 30th, 1999, they would successfully sue a small doujinshi production for creating a hentai VHS. Both incidents were over the Konami series entitled Tokimeki Memorial, with the latter lawsuit judgment basically being so bad that it essentially killed the VHS doujinshi market. Originally, I had planned to cover both of these lawsuits in the same video, considering they are over the same intellectual property, plus the copyright laws and judgment kind of overlap. However, both cases are important in their own right, as they both set a precedent in Japanese law that would have far-reaching consequences. It would be fucking rough to cram all this into one video, so to cover both more thoroughly, this week I'll be going over the hentai doujinshi case, while next week we'll be over the memory card data scandal. Don't worry, it's just as nutty as taking to someone to court over a hentai fan production. It's crazy to look back and realize how sue-happy Konami has been for the past 25 years. Yeah, their quote-unquote recent shitty practices aren't really anything new. In fairness, as we delve into both of these cases, I want to take special care and say, legally speaking, oftentimes Konami had legal right to do what they did, despite it not really being a good look for them. So it's not like they were paying lawmakers and the courts under the table for a favorable outcome that we know of. However, what started off as Konami suing bootleg game devices and hentai creators would set precedents in the Japanese entertainment market that would shape the outcome of not only the video game industry, but entertainment industry as a whole, both in Japan and out of it. This was the time Konami fucked all fan projects. Part 1. Now, before we get started today, I'm not a fucking lawyer, so none of this is going to be legal advice, and if you are in the market for legal advice, I highly recommend just spending a little bit of money to hire a licensed attorney. Back in 1994, Konami, the famous creators of... You all know who Konami is, so I'm not going to insult your intelligence. They developed what would become one of the pioneers of Japanese dating sims known as Tokimeki Memorial, releasing it on the PC Engine. It wasn't the first dating sim developed, but it was one that popularized the genre in Japan. And if you have played any games that involve friendship meters, social links, etc., well, you can thank Tokimeki Memorial for that. You may not have ever heard of this game franchise, but it was huge in Japan, and actually had a game come out as recently as 2018. Basically, the plot of Tokimeki Memorial, you have 3 years to woo the heart of any eligible character in the game before professing your love underneath a sacred tree. Yeah, the plot's pretty basic for the time, but you gotta think this was one of the pioneers of that particular subgenre. Now, technically, in the game, you have many different choices available for various characters to fall in love with. However, the breakout star and one of the main characters of the game is a girl by the name of Shiori Fujisaki. She's actually a pretty famous character in her own right, and ended up making a bunch of cameos in various Konami-related titles. In the mid-90s, Shiori Fujisaki and Tokimeki Memorial were household names, with the character herself being considered a virtual idol along the same lines as a Hatsune Miku or Lin Minmay. As we discovered on this channel, even in the far-gone eras of the 90s, porn still exists. There really aren't hard dates as to when the infamous hentai began production. However, the first copies of it were sold in January of 1997 from a store known as Messe Sanoh. This would put the creation of the hentai roughly mid to late 1996. I couldn't find any images of Messe Sanoh, but to the best of my understanding, Messe Sanoh was a slew of Japanese department stores focusing on video game sales and doujinshi type products. You may be asking yourself, how did they get away with selling copywritten material? The thing is, I think the Messe Sanoh was kind of like a pop-up shop type of storefront. Now, in copywritten material, though, that's where things get a little bit messy. See, the hentai itself never claimed to be Tokimeki Memorial. Instead, it went under the name Dogi Magi Imagination. This was in an attempt to market it more as a parody of the series rather than be labeled as a part of it. I have an article that's linked below that'll take you to a journal that was written on Japanese law and copyright and kind of goes over what, like, parody and fair use is there. A forewarning, it is all in Japanese and ran through the Wayback Machine, but if you use Google Translator though, it comes up relatively unbroken. According to the journal, under Japanese copyright law, which has no special legislation and no general provisions for restricting rights, it is unavoidable and natural to make a judgment within the conventional framework for judging copyright infringement. It is difficult to establish a definitional rule that defines the permissible range of parody, and there is a concern that easy quote-unquote free-writing parody will often be flooded by spoofing parody. So you can see copyright laws on parody, which can extend out to fan projects, are in the gray area at best. In truth, Dogi Magi Imagination at first didn't exactly make any waves. In fact, it remained relatively unknown for about a year, only going so far as to sell around 900 copies of the film. The film was only roughly about 10 minutes long, so you can be a judge on whether or not that would have been a good purchase. Now, it wouldn't be until Japanese publication Friday got a hold of the movie and decided to write a hit piece on it. And to quote Gaming.mo's Heidi Kemp's excellent article on the topic, that's when shit hit the fan. With Shiori Fujisaki being a household name, the mainstream media picked up on this story with the articles using taglines like "Shocking, Tokimeki Shiori Fujisaki performs" in a video. Leave it to the media to over-sensationalize the fuck out of anything. When in reality, it wasn't much different from other parodies or doujinshis of the time, but because it was Fujisaki, well, let's just say Konami went on a bit of a warpath. Keep in mind, at the time, this was one of Konami's most coveted characters, and with Japan being one half very prudish and the other being perverted as fuck, you can see Konami immediately shift into damage control mode. While Konami looked into who created the actual hentai, they put a stop to any and all doujinshis related to Tokimeki Memorial from releasing in any form, threatening legal action against any individuals or companies who would produce or sell unlicensed material of their properties. One of the most notable was a book titled Bishoujo Doujin 2 Tokimeki Album, which was supposed to be an anthology release. I can kind of understand why Konami freaked out the way that they did. If you're super protective of an IP and then all of a sudden you start seeing the media talking about how your really popular innocent character is now doing like lewd things in the media, you know, you'd probably freak out a little bit. On the other hand though, I mean, doujinshis weren't exactly a new thing, so it was only now that they decided, oh, this is a big deal. Dogi Magi Imagination today is super rare and almost impossible to find, which I imagine back then it was as equally hard to find as only about 900 copies circulating around at the time. However, Konami was able to track down a copy and figure out who created and produced the video. Soon afterwards, Konami would file the proper paperwork to begin litigation for a lawsuit against the defendants of Akishido, the circle who created the hentai, and the commissioner of the hentai, only known as Shane. And spoiler alert, because of this case, the rising popularity of VHS doujinshis would immediately stop, so it wasn't pretty. Attorneys on behalf of Konami made the argument that by utilizing the design and image of Fujisaki, that it had damaged the innocence of the character. Seriously. More importantly, they had stated that because the image of Fujisaki had been modified and impaired without the express permission of Konami, that their moral rights as creators of the entity and rights as the authors and creators of Tokimeki Memorial had been infringed upon. Basically, they were suing them for copyright infringement. The Japanese wiki on this particular case actually contains 3 different arguments the defendants have, so let's take a look at them. Their first defense was that the design of Fujisaki was a commonplace one and not a wholly original creation. They added to this by stating abstract characters do not become external expressional form and stating the design had no separate creativity other than the concrete design. Therefore, it should not be subject to copyright. Initially, it's a solid argument because they basically state the character is like of a generic design. No doubt referencing the fact she is simply a schoolgirl. Following this up by saying, other than Fujisaki herself, the core design of the character had no real creativity or originality. Which I don't entirely agree with, but they're arguing for fair use, so far, the arguments aren't that bad. Their next argument was that specifics from the video in correlation to what appears in the game should be taken into consideration. The utilization of symbols, names, or anything that would be found in the design of the software itself, which was not present in the hentai. I'm about 50-50 on this one because on the one hand, I think it's smart that they played the angle of, oh, they didn't use any sort of design choices or anything like that. On the other hand though, Fujisaki is from the game, and I'm gonna be completely real with you, they look fucking identical. So I think they shot themselves a bit in the foot right here because you can argue that Fujisaki is in a representable form via the software, and that could be looked upon as a symbol of the product or a part of the design choice. And their final defense was that even if the character of Fujisaki was damaged because of this, it doesn't actually matter because the game itself is about pure and innocent love, and that Fujisaki herself is designed to be an innocent honor student, while the woman in the video does not express these, and that it is about sexual relations. That's fucking stupid.
Stupid! You're so stupid!
I'm sorry, but a spade's a spade. Your argument is that it can't be copyright because there is clearly a porn character while the other is not. While in your other argument claiming Fujisaki is of a generic design devoid of any character. So in the final defense, they basically admit that Fujisaki is a character in the game and that the damage done to the property is only coincidental. I'm using my own words, of course. At best, I'm not gonna lie, if I was the defense attorney after reading that, I'd fucking quit. Unless it was the attorney's fault, which if that's the case, that guy sucks. So, as you probably guessed, Konami won the lawsuit and the defendant had to pay a reported 2,275,000 yen, which equals out to roughly 21,473 American by today's standards. Which isn't completely terrible by today's standards, but you gotta think this was in the 90s and a bunch of these people were probably just a bunch of otaku nerds who were basically making a fan-produced porno, so it probably ruined them. It also wouldn't be Konami if they didn't also try to get the courts to make the group publicly apologize for creating the hentai in the first place, effectively public shaming them. However, the courts effectively ruled that it was unnecessary. But really, that seems like such a fucking Konami move. In the trial, Konami was able to prove that not only was the design of the girl to be directly Fujisaki, but because of the likeness, circumstances in the porno and the game, that Konami's rights as the property holder were being infringed upon. So you're probably asking yourself, what the hell does any of this have to do with fan projects? Well, this court case in and of itself set the precedent for other potential court cases in the future. After the court case was settled and the defendants were found guilty, it literally stopped the entire VHS doujinshi market, which at the time only had a few circles involved. However, it was growing in popularity. After the judgment was passed, who would take the chance now that any major company could sue any creator of fan pornography? When I finished my last video on the weird world of Evangelion hentai, I ended up starting to uncover more and more doujinshi VHSs from the era, all varying in quality and not necessarily containing pornography. So I started thinking to myself, was I wrong in my assumptions? In truth, it's kind of 50-50. Now, VHS doujinshis existed and were often sold at comic market or smaller bootleg shops. However, after this lawsuit was finalized, it literally killed the entire market for them in Japan. A lot of these circles were usually commissioned out to make these doujinshis, and then after its creation, they would usually sell them to try to turn a little bit of a profit. The modern equivalent would be something akin to like a Patreon artist, etc. However, after the judgment was passed and a precedent was set, most independent circles disbanded because a lot of the time they were just passionate artists skating by and wouldn't be able to front the millions in yen they would have to pay in damages if charges were actually brought against them. So in one fell swoop, Konami single-handedly killed the growing VHS doujinshi market. This also lines up to my previous video as well because the Human Salvation Project release lines up around the time of this lawsuit, which actually kind of makes sense now why there was this video isn't for public consumption, like warning at the very beginning of the video. And it also kind of explains why the team is basically impossible to find at this point, but I digress. However, this doesn't just stop at the VHS doujinshi market, because during the litigation, the defendants had discussed that it was essentially just fan art, and that it was just a creative outlet and a part of creative culture in general, meaning it was only being distributed as a doujinshi among fans, not meant for retail consumption. However, the argument didn't stick, and no law was adopted that states fan work is protected under free use in Japanese law. To quote the law article I found, this indicates that even in the situations where unlicensed derivative work are distributed in places such as the comic market, no special treatment is given in the judgment of the court. So basically, all the company needs to do is take a look at your work and state that it's infringing on their rights as the copyright holder. Then insinuate it will damage said property and that the bootleg will be used to gain profits, and they can send cease and desist letters to anyone they feel could harm their product. It's not as simple as that, but I think you get it. What about countries outside of Japan? This is Japanese law, not American law, for example. Well, it's not as simple as that. Sticking with US as an example, as long as a company does business here, then they are subject to the courts here, specifically the Supreme Court and state courts. Thus, they can issue cease and desist letters based on the properties that are held. So what about fair use? Again, it's tricky. Here in the US, we do have fair use laws, and to oversimplify American copyright laws, a company's entities are protected in a similar manner. That being said, if Konami were to send a cease and desist letter to a group, technically they can fight in court and could potentially win if they can prove fair use, or that they didn't intend to sell it or distribute whatever fan content they were producing. There's also extradition. Now, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe there is a case where an individual or group was extradited to a foreign country because of a fan project, but depending on what treaties and terms we are on with that country, it is still entirely possible. Extradition would be up to the Supreme Courts and higher their governments, and in order to get that far, you gotta go through some shit to get there. However, it's still possible, and once you're over there, well, the Konami vs. Akishido case has already set a precedent. Simply put, you'll lose. Again, you'd have to be extradited for that to happen though. However, after Konami proved it was to successfully sue and destroy one fan project, it sent a signal to the rest that they could do it too. I'm not gonna pretend copyright law didn't exist prior to this. However, after a bunch of failed attempts, which we'll get into next week, this case kind of gave Japanese developers the balls to go after fan-produced content. So whether you're in the US or not, because these corporations have a presence here, fan games, fan movies, or anything that could potentially be harmful to the company's IPs will always be in jeopardy of being destroyed. I gotta stress, Konami was well within their rights as it was their IP, and in a way it was being damaged. However, I don't think it was really a great precedent to set. Left unchecked, it could eventually seep into other media forms. Say goodbye to Patreon commissions. Again, this precedent was set in Japan, however the US has similar laws, and because of this many fan projects have been killed off. And realistically, there isn't actually necessarily a good or bad guy in this story. It's just more of the gray area when you look into topics like this or discuss any sectors of law interpretation. So what do you think? Would you prefer more open copyright laws / less restrictions, or do you think it's a good thing companies are able to exercise their copyright muscle? Let me know in the comments below, and make sure to check back next week for part 2 as we go over Konami's continued conquest to destroy anybody that would affect Tokimeki's Memorial with the memory card controversy. Make sure to keep things light and rebellious, and I'll see you guys next time.